Over the centuries, many of the most incredible scientific discoveries have been made by amateurs. By modern definitions, even those as influential and prolific as Charles Darwin and Benjamin Franklin would be considered amateurs, as neither had any formal training in the areas where they made advances. But these discoveries have become less common as science has progressed, since scientific research now tends to require all sorts of highly specialized and typically expensive equipment. For example, there was no chance that an amateur could have discovered the Higgs boson with the homemade super collider that they tinkered with on weekends in their garage. This particular example may not have been possible, but amateur discoveries do still happen, and today we're going to look at some of the most astonishing scientific discoveries made by amateurs, including some from within the last century. On this channel, we often delve into obscure scientific discoveries and their broader implications because today's news isn't great at covering them. Either research is misinterpreted or deliberately misconstrued to give outlets a sensational angle to lead with, or is filtered through ideological biases, causing some publications to downplay or just completely ignore the issue, like climate change. That's where today's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. They were actually developed by a former NASA engineer who wanted a more data-driven and objective way to stay informed. So she created a platform that gathers diverse perspectives alongside original research for a comprehensive understanding of any topic. Like this new study on a key component of the AMOC remaining steady for decades despite growing fear of the entire system collapsing. There's only 16 sources reporting on this, with absolutely none coming from right-wing outlets. So if that's your media bubble, there's a good chance you missed it. Ground News also calculated that most of these sources are considered highly credible, meaning their reporting tends to be more objective than subjective. And from there, it's easy to compare how different outlets are spinning this study. Ground News makes it really easy, not just to see beyond sensationalism, but also to find important stories that your algorithm might not be showing you. So I highly recommend following anything from science to offbeat news on Ground News. If you go to ground.news/sideprojects or scan the QR code now, you'll save 40% on their unlimited access Vantage plan. It's worth it, and thank you to Ground News for sponsoring. Now back to it. Born in the electorate of Hanover in 1738, William Herschel was a musician both by occupation and by lineage. Herschel's father was an oboist in the Hanover military band, and Herschel played the oboe, violin, harpsichord, and the organ. In addition to being a performer, he was also a composer, writing 24 symphonies as well as numerous concertos, sonatas, and so on. He was leading a successful life as a musician, but at the age of 34, he became interested in pursuing astronomy in his free time. Herschel built his own telescopes by hand and would stare into the night sky, hoping to find something. In particular, he was looking for double stars, which are exactly what they sound like. These were pairs of stars that were very close together visually, like a binary star system. While some double stars are visible with the naked eye, Herschel was interested in finding ones that are not. It was believed that by measuring changes in the separation of these stars, that their distance from Earth could be measured. Herschel was so intent on finding these double stars that his plan was to systematically search every single star in the night sky to make sure that he found them all. Now, that's an ambitious plan, but Herschel saw a lot of success. In total, he identified and catalogued over 800 double stars or multiple star systems. But that's not what he's most well known for. On March the 13th, 1781, Herschel was examining stars in the constellation of Gemini when he noticed something unusual. Looking through his homemade telescope, he saw something that was appearing as a disk. His initial thought was that this was a comet, and he reported the sighting to the Astronomer Royal, Neville Maskelyne. Of course, he wasn't the first person to notice Uranus, as it was potentially first seen back in 128 BC. The first definitive sighting was in 1690, but all previous sightings simply reported it as being a star. Herschel was the first person to identify it as something else, and after consulting with an astronomer working out of Russia to calculate the supposed comet's orbit, it was determined that it was actually a planetary body beyond Saturn, not a comet at all. This was the first new planet discovered since ancient times, and Herschel became a celebrity overnight. King George III even appointed him to the position of King's Astronomer, no doubt aided by the fact that Herschel had tried to name the planet after King George, though obviously that name didn't take. Herschel continued his work in astronomy following this discovery, and he wound up making other important discoveries as well. He was a pioneer in astronomical spectroscopy, using prisms to analyze the wavelengths of light coming from stars. Not only can this give information about the chemical composition of a star, but it was through spectroscopy that he discovered both that invisible infrared light existed and that the sun produced infrared. He also discovered 2 moons of Uranus and 2 moons of Saturn, and he built a 40-foot telescope, the largest scientific instrument that had ever been built up to that point. While this was the telescope with which he discovered the moons of Saturn, it was not much of an improvement upon previous smaller telescopes as he had hoped. It became evident that no matter how big a telescope he built, they had already reached the limits of what was possible with the current technology. More powerful telescopes would not be built until advances in the engineering and manufacturing of high-quality mirrors were made decades later. Little is known about the early life of Felix de Herschel. For a long time, no one even knew what country he was born in, though the general consensus is that he was born in France. After high school, Felix spent several years biking around Europe, then traveling to South America, and then traveling around Europe some more. At the age of 24, he moved to Canada with his wife and daughter. Felix's father had died when he was only 6 years old, but a friend of his late father was able to pull some strings to get Felix a commission from the Canadian government to study the fermentation and distillation of maple syrup to schnapps. He then spent some time on a geological expedition, working as a medic despite having neither experience nor training as such. After he returned, he and his brother invested nearly all of their money into a chocolate factory that almost immediately went bankrupt. But while taking part in all of these other pursuits, Felix had also built a laboratory in the house where he could teach himself microbiology as he continued to study fermentation in his spare time. His work had him traveling the world to focus on producing schnapps from various plants, and in 1911 he moved his family back to Paris so that he could oversee the construction of machines for mass-producing schnapps from sisal, a type of agave related to the plants used to make tequila. In Paris, Felix also began work at the Pasteur Institute, where he was an unpaid lab assistant. During World War I, he was tasked with producing some 12 million doses of medication for the Allied forces, but it was in the 1910s, so the term medication was used a little bit loosely. The most common ingredients in those medications were arsenic, strychnine, mercury, and cocaine. But it wasn't long after that when Felix made his big discovery. In 1915, British bacteriologist Frederick Twort discovered something that could infect and kill bacteria. He believed that something was either an enzyme or, more likely, a virus, but the combination of war and a lack of funding prevented him from pursuing the matter any further. Independent of Twort's discovery, in 1917, Felix also discovered an invisible antagonistic microbe that could infect and kill bacteria. Unlike Twort, who was not sure of exactly what he had discovered, Felix had no doubt. It was clearly a virus that preyed on bacteria, and so he named them bacteriophages. To many, phages were seen as a nuisance that interfered with the fermentation process of products like cheese, but to Felix, this was a potential medical miracle. Phages could be isolated using a porcelain filter that would prevent anything the size of a bacterium or larger from passing through. Felix began by filtering chicken feces to collect phages, which he then used to successfully treat a plague of chicken typhoid. That was enough of a proof of concept for him to immediately start moving on to human testing. Shortly thereafter, he cured someone of dysentery with the world's first application of phage therapy. Despite the incredible discovery, by the end of 1920, Felix was still an unpaid assistant at the Pasteur Institute. He wrote a detailed paper about his work with phages and tricked the assistant director into releasing it as an official publication of the Pasteur Institute, after which time he began to receive recognition for his work thanks to the implied endorsement from the institute. He might have received recognition sooner, but a lot of scientists weren't thrilled about the amateur microbiologist who was a bit too eager to experiment on humans. Phage therapy quickly was largely phased out with the discovery of antibiotics, which were considered to be cheaper and safer. However, the practice has continued in some parts of the world, and with the rise of antibiotic resistance in bacteria, there has been renewed interest in the possibility of phage therapy in the US. While it is not approved by the FDA except in extremely specialized cases, there is a chance that we will see an increase in the use of it in the decades to come. In the 1820s, French mathematician and physicist Joseph Fourier noticed that the Earth was warmer than it should have been based on its distance from the Sun, assuming it was only being heated by solar rays. He considered that human activity may have been a contributing factor, though he proposed other solutions as well. In 1856, American scientist and inventor Eunice Lawton Foote published a paper showing that carbon dioxide gas absorbed heat and thus changing amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere could result in changing temperatures on Earth. This was later demonstrated by Irish physicist John Tyndall, and in 1901 the word greenhouse was first used to describe these effects by Swedish meteorologist Nils Gustav Ekholm. For a century, scientists from all over the world kept circling around a major discovery, but they were never able to pull all the pieces of the puzzle together. That was going to take the research of English steam engineer and high school dropout Guy Callendar. Alright, just referring to Callendar as a high school dropout is a bit unfair. When World War I broke out, he did leave school without finishing so that he could enlist, but he was unable to serve because he was partially blind in one eye from an accident when he was 5. Instead, he began working in his father's lab at Imperial College, where they performed research and testing for the Air Ministry. After a few years, Callendar earned certificates in mechanics and mathematics from City and Guilds College, though never a degree. That said, apprenticing for his father was undoubtedly more valuable than an extra year or two in high school would have been. His father, Hugh Longbourn Callendar, was a famed physicist who was thrice nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics, though he never won. But none of that really had anything to do with climate, so Callendar was still very much an amateur climatologist. Using publicly available records, he checked average global mean temperatures from the Smithsonian Institute, among others, and calculated how much CO2 was being added to the atmosphere on an annual basis. Based on the available records, he estimated that 150 billion tons of CO2 had been released into the atmosphere over the previous 50 years, accounting for a raise in global temperatures of about 0.03 degrees Celsius per year. Notably, he did state that this rate could accelerate if the amount of CO2 released increased, which it absolutely did. In 1938, Callendar became the first person to publish a paper detailing the effects of global warming, originally called Callendar Effect. At first, his discoveries were shrugged off. Callendar was just an amateur, so clearly his data or calculations were wrong. Besides, people are so small, and the Earth is so big. How could anything we do possibly influence something so large? Director of the British Meteorological Society, Sir George Simpson, stated that Callendar's findings could only be seen as a coincidence. Over the next couple of decades, Callendar continued to publish papers about his findings, and eventually he started to convince other scientists. He didn't convince them that he was correct, just that more research into the idea of anthropogenic global warming needed to be conducted. In 1964, Callendar passed away, still convinced that he was right, even though the majority of mainstream scientists were still skeptical of his claims. However, while Callendar's findings that human activity was causing the Earth to warm were correct, his conclusions about what that meant for the world were very wrong. In Callendar's mind, global warming was a good thing. His grandparents had been alive during the Little Ice Age, when temperatures, predominantly in Europe, fell by about 2 degrees Celsius. This drop in temperature caused widespread crop failure, famine, and death. Callendar believed that higher temperatures would increase the range of crops, lengthen the growing season, and indefinitely delay the return of deadly glaciers. What he failed to predict was an increase in natural disasters, rising sea levels, and disruptions to ecosystems. He was right about the last part, though, as humans in the foreseeable future are unlikely to ever experience glaciers, deadly or otherwise. When it comes to the research of chimpanzees, the first name that's likely going to come to mind is Jane Goodall. But when Goodall began her research, she had no formal training at all in primatology or in any other science for that matter. As a child, Goodall had been given a stuffed chimpanzee instead of a teddy bear. She credits her fondness for this toy, which she still owns, with her early love of animals. After graduating from high school, she attended secretarial school. That was the extent of her education when she traveled to Kenya at the age of 23. Goodall had a friend who owned a farm in the Kenyan highlands, so she traveled there to spend time with the animals while also working as a secretary. Following the advice of her friend, Goodall made a phone call to a famed archaeologist and paleontologist called Louis Leakey. All she wanted to do was schedule a meeting so they could talk about animals together, but Leakey had other ideas in mind. He was looking for a chimpanzee researcher at the time, though he didn't inform Goodall of this immediately. Instead, he invited her to come and work as his secretary, at which point he proposed sending her to do field research. She lacked any formal training, but Leakey was of the opinion that this was a good thing. Goodall would conduct her research with an open mind, rather than having her observations be tainted by preconceived notions about primate behavior. And this turned out to be a good decision, as both her techniques and findings were revolutionary. Goodall was first sent to Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, but it was her research in Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania where she made her most groundbreaking discoveries. She spent years and eventually decades in Gombe conducting her research, and the dedication to her long-term research was unprecedented. She lived in the nature reserve along with her mother and a cook because the local authorities were adamant that a young English girl would not survive out there alone. But from dawn to dusk, Goodall was following the chimpanzees and observing their behavior. At first, they were wary of her presence, but over time, they became accustomed to her being there, and they allowed her to slowly come closer and closer to the group. Eventually, Goodall became the only known human to ever be accepted into a chimpanzee society, even if she was their lowest-ranking member. For the benefit of furthering her career, Leakey insisted that Goodall acquire a PhD. He arranged funding for her studies, and Goodall became the 8th person ever allowed to study for a PhD at Cambridge without having first attained a bachelor's degree. Her PhD thesis was based on her first 5 years of research in Gombe, during which she had already made revolutionary discoveries. One day, Goodall observed a chimpanzee chimpanzee she had named David Greybeard pull a branch off a tree, stripping it of leaves and twigs, and then inserting it into a termite's nest to pull out all the delicious termites. At the time, tools were considered to be strictly the domain of humans, and that the use of tools is what indeed made us human. Observing a chimpanzee not only utilize but craft a tool, no matter how rudimentary, was a shocking discovery. It was also believed at the time that chimpanzees were vegetarians, though Goodall observed hunting parties kill and eat smaller primates like colobus monkeys. Both of these discoveries challenged long-standing beliefs about chimpanzees, but she wasn't done yet. She also kept records of each individual chimpanzee's personality, mood, and their social interactions. She also watched as a group of violent chimpanzees splintered off from the main group and eventually launched the Gombe Chimpanzee War. It was a 4-year conflict between the two groups that didn't end until all of the males in one group were dead. Primatologists at the time were dismissive of Goodall's research on the socialization of chimpanzees, believing that she was anthropomorphizing the animals and describing to them human traits that they simply weren't capable of possessing. But for her part, Goodall was largely unconcerned with that criticism. She once stated, "You cannot share your life with a dog or a cat and not know perfectly well that animals have personalities and minds and feelings." She knew that the scientists criticizing her work were aware of this as well, but they simply couldn't admit it because anthropomorphism was considered the worst ethological sin at the time. Though she was an amateur when she began her research with no formal training, Goodall has since become the world's foremost authority on chimpanzees, recognized for her countless discoveries about their behavior and its similarity to human behavior.